Hello everyone, nice to meet you again. Today we're going to discuss another type of analysis using SPSS, namely correlation analysis in language research with me, Pak Afif Wan Muslimin. So before we do the correlation analysis, the things that you have to do is that you have to do a prerequisite analysis, namely normality test and homogeneity test. What is test of normality? This is a test of to examine whether the data follow a normal distribution or not. So the purpose is that to assess whether the data are symmetrically distributed to determine the appropriateness of parametric statistical tests. So if the data is less than 50, so you have to consider to look at Shapiro-Wilks test result. But if the data is containing more than 50 participants or data, so you can consider the column that named Kolmogorov-Smirnov test. How to interpret the normality test? So if the p-value is more than 0.05, so the data is considered normally distributed. But if the data is less than 0.05, so the data is understood as not normally distributed. If the data is normal, so you can go to Pearson correlation test analysis. But if the data is not normal, so you have to go to Spearman correlation test. So what is Spearman correlation test? You can go to the next video. So let's have a real practice. Just imagine that you have a data more than 30, but here for practice only to make you used to apply the SPSS. So I provide you 5 data only. So we have 5 students that I'm interested to know whether there is correlations between hours of watching YouTube per week with the speaking test score. So please insert this data into SPSS. Have you done it? Great. So if you have finished inserting this data into your SPSS, how can we do the normality test? You can follow this step. First, go to SPSS, do the analysis step by clicking Analyze, then go to Descriptive Statistic and click Explore, insert the score to the dependence list, and then click Plots, click Normality Plots with Test, click Continue, and OK. So if you successfully do the step, then you can find the results like this. So this table shows 2 types of test results. So the first one is Kolmogorov-Smirnov, and the second one is Shapiro-Wilks. So which one should you focus on? You should, your sample size is very small, that is only 5. So the appropriate test to interpret is Shapiro-Wilks test, not Kolmogorov-Smirnov. So in this case, you can see from the data that YouTube scores is 0.8754 for the significant value. So it means that this is higher than 0.05. So the data for this variable is normally distributed. And also for the speaking score. So the significant value is 0.618. So this is more than 0.05. So the data is also normally distributed. Then how can we do the test of homogeneity? Test of homogeneity is applied to evaluate whether the different groups have equal variance, which is crucial in comparative analysis. So if you are doing experimental study by comparing 2 groups, experimental group and control groups, so you have to do this kind of test or homogeneity test. So what is the purpose? To ensure that the variability across groups is similar to support valid group comparison. So how can we do that? So we will do Levin's test with SPSS. How to interpret the result of the homogeneity test? So if the p-value is more than 0.05, so it's understood as homogeneous. But if the p-value is less than 0.05, so there is a variances, or it means that the data are not homogeneous. How can we interpret this kind of situations? If the data is homogeneous, so you can go to parametric test or doing independent t-test. But if your data is not homogeneous, so you have to apply another type of test or non-parametric methods. So let's have a real practice. Again, we applied the previous data that you have typed. to test the normality. Now let's apply the data for homogeneity test. So you can go to SPSS, do this steps by step that I will share to you. First, click Analyze, then click Compare Means. After that, you will find one-way ANOVA, then insert the score to dependence list, and group or class to factor part. Then after that, click Option. Don't forget to tick Homogeneity. Then after that, click Continue, then OK. So if you successfully followed these steps, then you will see the results like this. So the significant value from the test of homogeneity of variance is 0.007, or this one is lower than 0.05, or it means that the data are not homogeneous. So I also did a kind of experiment by changing the types of data from 1 digit for hours of YouTube into 2 digits. Then amazingly, the results is different. So the test of homogeneity of variance shows that the significant value is above 0.05 or 0.075. So it means that the data now become homogeneous. How if the data is normally distributed, but the data is not are not homogeneous? So what you should do if your study is correlation, so no need for you to consider a lot the homogeneity of variance tests. So just keep going with the Pearson correlations as long as both variables are normally distributed and the relationship is linear, so no adjustment is needed. But if you applied a comparative study by comparing two groups, for example, experimental and also control group, so what if the data is normal, but it's not homogeneous? So you can apply between two options. So the first one, use adjusted parametric test from t-test to Wells t-test. So for ANOVA, you can tick Wells ANOVA or Brown Forsyth test. For option B, you can apply non-parametric test. And this one is more, safe or safer alternative for you to apply. For independent t-test, you can apply Mann-Whitney U-test. And how we can apply this one? So you can go to the next video. Or for ANOVA, you can apply Kruskal-Wallis test. Now, after you finish doing a normality test and the data is normal, so you can go to correlation test or Pearson correlation test. But before we go there, you have to remember that what is correlation study? This is a study that measures relationship between two continuous variables. And there will be discussions about directions and strength. And the next one, it doesn't mean that we're going to discuss about the cause and effect. What we need to know is on the relationship between variables. There are some samples of research titles. So the first one is correlations between YouTube engagement and speaking performance in EFL classroom. And the second one, if we have a title like analyzing the link between English learning motivation and academic achievement in EFL context. Or the third, we need to know the correlation study between reading habits and vocabulary mastery among Indonesian EFL students. So in here, we can see that type of correlation are two. So the first one, if the data is normal, you can apply Pearson correlations. But if the data is not normal, you have to do Spearman test. And we talk about types of data. In Spearman, the data is in the form of rank in class or effort score or ordinal. But for Pearson, the data is in the form of ordinary scores, for example, like reading score, speaking score. And remember, in interpreting the data of SPSS analysis results, so we can find R value. What is R value? This is a Pearson correlations. So this R value have different range of strength. So if the R value is 0.41, it means that it belongs to moderate strength of relationship. And you have to remember that the relationship between two variables are two. It can be positive or even it can be negative. What happens if the relationship is negative? So it means that if one variable goes up, the other variable goes down. Or for example, when we are discussing about anxiety and speaking ability, yes, we understand in logic that um, for those who have high anxiety, their speaking score will be lower, or vice versa. Then, if we have done the Pearson correlations analysis using SPSS, we have to understand how can we read the result. So if the p-value is less than 0.05, it means that there is a correlation. On the other way, if the p-value is more than 0.05, so it shows that there is no correlations. So if we have an example of data like the R value is 0.74 and the significant value or p-value is less than 0.01, so we can understand that there was a strong positive correlation between variable A to variable B. Now let's have a real practice by doing Pearson correlations test with your SPSS. So you have learned on how to calculate normality and also homogeneity. You can keep going with the data and you can follow these steps. So the first you go to SPSS, then follow this step. First, click analyze, and then click correlate, click bivariate, and then tick Pearson. So if you follow the step correctly, you can find the results like this one. So you can find the table. So we have the hours of YouTube watching. So we can see that the significant two-tail value is 0.01, or this one is lower than 0.05. So it means that there is correlations between two variables. And we can see that the Pearson correlations or the R score is 0.994, and it belongs to very strong correlations. So in this case, we can see that the Pearson correlations coefficient so R is 0.1994, shows that it is a very strong correlations and positive. And from the significant two-tail value, this is 0.001. It means that there is correlations between two variables. So our conclusion is there is a very strong positive relationship between numbers of our students watch YouTube per week and their speaking score. So for the last, we can understand that correlation is different with causations. And the choice is that choose the right test based on scale and distributions. If the data is ordinal, so you have to use Spearman. But if the data have a very clear and uh, valid range between one and another, use Pearson. You have to look at the score of R and P when you would like to interpret the result of statistical calculations using Pearson correlations. And you learn that the directions of the correlation can be positive, can be negative. So that's all for today. Thank you for keep going with the statistical video and have a nice try with your SPSS. Good luck.